Most people assume that personality is something fixed, something you either have or you don't. They believe some people are naturally unique, naturally creative, and naturally different, while others simply blend into the background of society. And over time, many people began accepting that they belong to that second category. But that assumption hides something important. Because if you look closely at your own life, you will probably remember a time when your mind worked differently than it does today. There were ideas that excited you for no practical reason. There were interests that fascinated you, even if no one around you understood them. You noticed things other people ignored, and you had opinions that didn't always match the expectations of the people around you. In other words, you weren't born ordinary, because no one really is. But somewhere along the way, something subtle began to change. You started filtering what you say. You started hiding the things that make you different. And slowly, without noticing it, you began becoming someone the world finds easier to accept. And the most amazing part is, no one forced you to do it. You did it yourself. Today, we're going to understand exactly how that happens. Welcome to the Glitch Cult, where we question the patterns people rarely notice and examine the truths that most people choose to ignore. If you want to understand how a person slowly ruins their own unique personality, you cannot begin by looking at dramatic failures or sudden life decisions, because that is rarely where individuality disappears. The real shift happens much earlier and much more quietly, at the moment when a person gradually stops exploring the world through their own curiosity and begins accepting the world exactly as it is presented to them. When you are young, curiosity tends to guide your attention naturally. You ask questions about things that seem strange or confusing. You become fascinated by ideas that others may find unusual, and you experiment with different interests simply because something about them captured your attention. At that stage, your personality is shaped by exploration. Your mind moves freely between possibilities, and there is very little pressure to limit yourself to what everyone else is doing. But as time passes, something subtle begins to change in the ways that most people engage with the world around them. Instead of asking questions about why things are the way they are, they begin focusing on how things are usually done. Curiosity slowly gives way to familiarity. The desire to understand gives way to the desire to fit comfortably into existing systems. You can see this shift in many areas of life. When people are younger, they often imagine different paths for themselves, sometimes strange or unconventional ones. They imagine building things, exploring unusual careers, creating ideas that do not yet exist, or simply living in ways that feel meaningful to them. But over time, those possibilities begin narrowing. Instead of exploring what might be possible, people begin focusing on what appears realistic, practical, and socially accepted. This transition rarely feels like giving up on individuality. It feels like becoming sensible. People tell themselves that they are simply learning how the world works and adjusting their expectations accordingly. They observe what others are doing, notice which paths appear stable and predictable, and gradually align their own choices with those patterns. As this process continues, curiosity becomes less active. Instead of asking why a system exists or whether a different path might be possible, people begin assuming that the existing structure is simply the way things are meant to be. The desire to experiment fades. The willingness to try unusual ideas decreases. Slowly, the instinct to explore is replaced by the instinct to follow. What disappears during this shift is not just curiosity, but several other parts of a person's natural personality. Creativity becomes quieter because creativity requires exploration and risk. Courage becomes weaker because courage depends on the willingness to step outside familiar patterns. Independent thinking becomes less frequent because independent thinking requires questioning what everyone else accepts. Gradually, a person begins moving through life, according to structures that were already established long before they arrived. Their choices become more predictable because they are guided by what is commonly done rather than what is personally discovered. Their ambitions begin aligning with widely recognized definitions of success rather than with their own evolving sense of meaning. And this is where the quiet transformation begins. A personality that once developed through curiosity, experimentation, and imagination slowly becomes shaped by repetition, familiarity, and social expectation. Nothing dramatic has happened. There has been no moment of obvious loss. Yet something important has quietly faded. The instinct to explore life in a way that reflects the full range of who you might have been. Once curiosity, experimentation, and independent exploration begin fading from a person's life, the next stage of the transformation becomes almost inevitable. When people stop discovering themselves through their own experiences, they naturally begin shaping themselves through the patterns they observe in others. At this stage, the personality does not disappear entirely, but it gradually becomes constructed from influences that already exist around you. Instead of building a life based on personal exploration, people begin assembling their identity from pieces that are already widely accepted within society. You can observe this in the way people make many of their major life decisions. Instead of asking themselves what kind of work genuinely interests them or what kind of life structure would allow them to grow and explore their abilities, they often begin by looking at what most other people are doing. They see millions of individuals following similar paths, pursuing the same definitions of stability and success, and it begins to feel natural to do the same. This process rarely feels like imitation. It feels like normal participation in society. People pursue certain careers because those careers appear respectable. They organize their lives around schedules and routines that everyone else seems to follow. They adopt ambitions that sound impressive in conversations because those ambitions are widely recognized and rewarded. The more this pattern repeats itself, the more difficult it becomes to recognize that individuality is slowly fading. When everyone around you is moving in similar directions, the environment itself begins to reinforce the idea that this is simply the correct way to live. The presence of millions of people doing the same thing creates a powerful sense of validation. But something important happens when a person's identity is shaped primarily by external patterns. The traits that once made them unpredictable begin to disappear. Curiosity weakens because the path ahead has already been defined. Creativity fades because there is little reason to invent something new when the accepted structure already exists. Courage declines because stepping outside the pattern now feels unnecessary and even risky. Over time, the personality begins aligning more closely with what society finds comfortable and understandable. Conversations become easier because your ideas resemble the ideas of others. Your ambitions become easier to explain because they follow familiar scripts. Your life begins to resemble countless other lives moving through the same predictable structure. From the outside, this can look like stability and normal success. But internally, something more complex has occurred. The unique combination of interests, instincts, and possibilities that once had the potential to develop into something distinct has gradually been replaced by something more standardized. And this is how a person slowly becomes ordinary, not through failure or weakness, but through years of quiet alignment with what is familiar, accepted, and widely practiced. The world offers these patterns constantly, but the moment a person stops questioning them and begins following them automatically, the transformation begins. In the end, the loss of uniqueness rarely feels like a loss at all. It simply feels like becoming normal. And because normality is so widely shared, most people never stop to ask themselves whether the life they're building reflects who they truly are, or whether it simply reflects the pattern they learned to follow. Most people never notice the real cost of this process. The cost is not simply becoming ordinary. The real cost is the future that slowly disappears while you are becoming ordinary. Every person begins life with certain interests that pull their attention in specific directions. Certain ideas excite them more than others. Certain problems make them curious. Certain ambitions begin forming quietly in the background of their mind. Those early signals are often the starting point of unique growth, because they lead people toward paths that are not already crowded. But when a person slowly learns to follow what is familiar and socially validated, those signals begin to fade. Instead of building something that reflects their own curiosity and vision, they begin investing their time and energy into structures that millions of other people are already maintaining. Over time, the ambitions that once belonged to them personally are replaced by ambitions that simply make sense within the system around them. The tragedy is that the possibilities connected to those original interests never completely disappear. They simply remain unexplored. And because they remain unexplored, most people never get the chance to see what kind of life those possibilities might have created. The path that feels normal is often the same path that quietly disconnects you from the version of yourself that might have grown the most.